In many countries around the world, certainly English-speaking countries, the concept of harassment has been legally defined from the top down by people in authority in order to restrain your freedom of speech and your right to protest. When you look into the laws in the particular country you live in, you'll find that some of those restraints exist for good reason, and some not so much. I'm a Canadian citizen living in China. The legal definition of harassment in Canada is actually quite good and useful and worth knowing, even if you're not Canadian. If, for example, you are British, you will probably be quite envious of how clear, lucid, and useful our legal definition of harassment is in Canada, in contrast to the morass of really lousy laws that you have in England. Now, the concept of harassment, it comes up here on the internet, basically when one internet opinion maker is trying to deprive another of the right to express their opinion, something I find rather sad and pathetic almost all the time. But it also comes up in the world of real-world activism, street activism, protests, organized dissent of almost any kind and every kind. In England, after about 1997, they had an extremely vaguely worded law that was used to punish protesters, anti-war protesters, environmental protesters, all kinds of different political protesters. But it included the caveat that a protester must speak to someone twice, or give a handwritten notice, or express themselves repeatedly to a person before what they did could be considered harassment. And I read many articles complaining. Now, I have to admit, these were very biased articles from very biased sources in England, complaining that at that time, people were charged with harassment, people expressing their political opinions, political dissent, political protest, for example, by sending an email that went to the same recipient twice. They could then be charged with harassment. And one of the most extreme examples was allegedly, again, I was really from a biased source, but allegedly a couple, husband and wife, who were standing on the street holding their baby while protesting against an arms show. So, a weapons expo where the arms industry promotes their products. They were pro-peace or anti-war protesters, whatever you want to say. And they were charged with harassment for standing there on the street. I think they had a sign, and I think they were handing out leaflets under this law as it then existed. Now, again, these were biased sources. You have to be very careful. One of the most extreme misrepresentations of a peaceful protest in the mainstream press was an ecological activist group called MOVE, M-O-V-E. You can very quickly find sources on the internet that claim these were nonviolent protesters who were somehow very unfairly brutalized by police. If you do a little bit of digging, a little bit of reading of objective sources and the bare facts the police were facing against, it was definitely not nonviolent. There were very real weapons charges, and although the police ultimately did use violence against that group, if you go through step by step who did what at which time, you'll find that basically supporters of the group have published a lot of misinformation on the internet. So even that example I just gave that I read in an ostensibly honest article about that couple with a baby, standing and peacefully protesting. I don't really know how peaceful they were. I only know this one kind of biased account. I myself, as a vegan, back when I had a newborn baby, I can remember going to political events with my wife, who's now my ex-wife, and where I was literally holding a newborn baby in my arms, attending political events related to veganism. So obviously it's an example I sympathize with immediately. It's very effective propaganda. But is it really true? That article, maybe it just failed to mention that the same people were lighting bonfires. Something very simple like that might justify what the police did and might just not be mentioned in a biased account of these things. So anyway, with that caveat having been stated, the laws that were in place in England around the late 1990s, 1997 as I recall, they were already absurdly repressive, absurdly restrictive of freedom of speech, the right to protest and dissent, in the name of harassment. And they left the concept of harassment incredibly vaguely defined. That got even worse with a notorious law written in 2005 called the Serious Organized Crime and Police Act. Now, I remember reading an article objecting to this legal act by Georges Monbiot, a famous journalist. Before making this video, I Googled Monbiot to see how many articles he had made following up on that. And I could only find one article. I could only find one article by Monbiot that had the name of that law in it. So it seems to me that he lost interest in it fairly quickly. Maybe I'm mistaken. Maybe he's written about it in books or in some format that I couldn't find on the internet with a quick Google search. However, this relates back to vegans, animal rights, and ecology in many ways. To quote Wikipedia itself, on the Serious Organized Crime and Police Act of 2005, according to Baroness Scotland of Ashall, promoting the bill in the House of Lords, this provision and the associated provisions of Section 3A were intended to strengthen, quote, the protection afforded to the bioscience industry and those who work in it, close quote, including, quote, making it an offense to protest outside a person's home in a way that causes harassment, alarm, or distress to the residents of that home, close quote. Now, in an earlier video I made that was defending Sorcha Morava, because people have accused Sorcha Morava of being a militant vegan, I talked a little bit about the history of real militant vegans in the United Kingdom, animal rights extremists, who from my perspective were pretty much lunatics and who've really given us all a bad name, people who engaged in violent and non-democratic protest. And it is true that they have also informed a generation of legislators, of lawmakers, of people in positions of power who are now incredibly strongly biased against us. Peaceful protesters, democratic, organized dissenters in my generation have to deal with the legacy of really lousy activism from the older generation. And the writing of this law reflects that. Now, Section 1A, sorry, I hate this. I hate reading text. I'd really prefer to just do a completely spontaneous recording, but let's get this right. So, the Serious Organized Crime and Police Act, pardon me, now I'm going to sneeze. You see how hard it is to be a YouTuber? I don't have to wear costumes or, put on accents the way Vegan Gains does, but still, hard work. Anyway, the actual wording that I'll remember for the rest of my life is that it makes illegal as harassment any act undertaken with the intention of persuading a person to do something they do not want to do, or to not do something that they do want to do. Sorry, don't you think I mixed that up? So the law is so vaguely worded. If you ask what really is harassment under this law, harassment can be trying to persuade anyone to not do something they do want to do, or to do something they do not want to do, if they're legally allowed to do that thing. So this was brought up in the old days. There were protests against McDonald's in England and the United Kingdom. And naturally, a protest that tries to convince people to not eat at McDonald's would therefore be harassment under this law. Almost any expression of political dissent is an attempt to convince people to do something or not do something. So these are sweeping laws that have terrible implications for us as vegans, anyone interested in ecology or animal rights, frankly, anyone who's sincerely interested in democracy and in making the world a better place. It's terrifying. Now, in contrast to this, and look, this is why I say many times I really do believe in freedom of speech. I really do stick up for the freedom of speech of people like Sorcha Morava and people like Durian Ryder, people who are not my friends, for my fellow vegans. Freedom of speech is tremendously important. Understanding what harassment is and how it pertains to you as a vegan, as an activist, as a protester, how it pertains to you on the internet, how it pertains to you on the street, etc., in the country you live in, is also tremendously important. We live in an era where, on the one hand, people in positions of real authority and power, people in the political establishment, vilify protesters, try to punish political dissidents as if they were stalkers, as if they were terrorists, as if they were guilty of harassment, in this incredibly vague definition of harassment. And then, on the other hand, we have this kind of really crummy subculture of people on the internet who don't want to engage in debate or are uncomfortable with a debate, simply trying to shut someone down by saying that they're guilty of harassment by expressing their opinion in a debate. And I saw that I had comments coming in saying that Sorcha Morava was guilty of harassment because, she called someone dumb. She called someone the dumbest YouTuber. Calling someone dumb is not harassment. And, you may say it's inarticulate, you may say it's unintelligent, you may say it's a poor argument. Okay, fine. Continue the debate. Engage in critique. Maybe you have something deeper and more meaningful to say than just to call somebody dumb or what have you. But it's not harassment. And we as vegans should not be silencing one another in this way. by calling things harassment that are not. Now, some of you will know there's a totally phony controversy saying that some of the articles on my former blog were harassment. I would like to state my informed opinion that not a single one of the blog entries on my blog qualifies harassment, definitely not under Canadian law. I'll tell you Canadian legal definition of harassment in just a moment because it's of interest to me as I'm Canadian. I'm not British. I'm not stuck with the really lousy definitions of harassment in England. And by the way, if you are a political activist of any kind, vegan or non-vegan, you should get organized to change the laws in England so that you have a responsible and meaningful definition of harassment. Oh, and I wanted to say as a concession to the other side, I sympathize with these legislators. So what? Baroness Scotland of Ashall in the House of Lords. These people may be assholes. I have no reason to sympathize with them. But let me tell you, I think there are real questions here. Most of the legislation about the right to public protest assumes that those protests take place in a public square. They take place at City Hall, at a local provincial parliament, at some kind of appropriate venue. I think there actually is an open question of whether or not it should be legal to protest at someone's house. And they were responding to the militancy and extremism and real violence of animal rights protesters and people like us, people who were variously vegetarian, vegan, what have you, animal rights protesters, who were, doing really unforgivable, illegal, and violent things to try to intimidate university professors and scientific researchers who were, engaged in vivisection. But the response, again, in my earlier video that talks about SORCPA and talks about who is a militant and what is the meaning of the word militant, I think I gave a really stirring example of that and really asked some of the tough questions where vegans have to look in the mirror and look back at our own history and realize we have a bad reputation for a reason, and we're stuck with it. I'm not comfortable with it. I'm completely against violence. I completely support only nonviolent protest working within the democratic system if you live in a democracy. If you don't live in a democracy, a very different set of questions to ask yourself about how you're going to bring about social and ecological change. It's very sad. But speaking for the Western democracies of the world, we need to be aware of what the legal definitions of harassment are. We can change those legal definitions precisely by lobbying Parliament or what have you. But then also, if you're engaged in any form of protest that comes up close to the definition of harassment, you need to really reconsider your strategy. You need to reconsider your methods, what you're doing, and why you're doing it. In any case, coming back to my blog, I do not believe a single one of the written entries on my blog counts as harassment, and none of them are even using coarse language or insults near the level of a normal Reddit conversation, these discussion forums like Reddit on the internet. None of them are all that racy or shocking. But with that being said, back when the blog was still ongoing, back when this was new and people were writing to me, I remember there only being one person, these are all anonymous people, who wrote in with me to actually debate what I was doing on the blog. Wrote in and said that they, to talk to me about whether or not this was harassment, what I was doing on the blog. I remember, they lost the argument, they lost the conversation, they lost the debate. I said very simply, well, you have to compare what I'm doing on this blog to what any newspaper did in the world of old media. Your claim, this person writing to me, their claim was that simply by taking a photograph of a person that's publicly available and putting a quotation on that photograph that is accurately quoting what the person said, like a screenshot of something they said on Twitter, that you're claiming that is harassment. And on the contrary, that's what every newspaper in the world does every day. Now, I think in different countries, there might be an interesting debate to be had. What if I take your photograph and then I modify it to make you look ugly, or to make you look fat, or to make you look sick? Newspapers do that also. Now, should that be legal or illegal? That's a different question. In some countries, it's legal. In some countries, it's illegal to modify a photograph. And in some countries, it's legal only if you have a footnote at the bottom saying that you've modified the photograph, that it's not accurate. What if I have your photograph and then I put on top of it a quote that you didn't say? What if I have a photograph of the Prime Minister of Canada, but it's actually a quote from the Prime Minister of France? What if it's a photograph of Obama, but I have a quote from, someone from the Republican Party? I have Mitt Romney. I have somebody else quoted. It's not something Obama said. Is that harassment? Now, actually, I think almost nowhere in the world would that be considered harassment. Maybe in Singapore or something. Maybe in some of the countries that have very, very tight restrictions on freedom of the press and freedom of expression. But actually, even if you did that, even if you were distorting the photograph, even if you were distorting what the person had said or misrepresenting what the person said, it still isn't harassment. But what I did in that blog, and having a photograph of someone and then having a quote from them, how could anyone possibly define that as harassment, even in this world where, as I've just described in England, governments often have, I think cynically, passed laws that define harassment so broadly that anything can be harassment. So, I mean, in England, if I try to convince you to do something or not do something, legally, under an act given the absurd title, the Serious Organized Crime and Police Act, this is not serious organized crime. This could be harassment. And in fact, people can be deprived of their freedom of speech. And again, some very biased articles I've read had very stirring examples of people being given criminal records and having to face courts for what should be proper democratic exercise of their freedom of speech. I'm not British. Probably some of the commenters below this video will know more about what I'm talking about because their lives have been more caught up in this sort of thing. And I've also said at the same time, I think there are debates to be had. Probably some countries should pass laws saying, okay, look, it's okay to protest in a public place and define what a public place is, but maybe it's not okay to protest on somebody's front lawn or to protest even in front of an apartment building where people are trying to sleep at night. I'm actually open-minded about that. I think different countries can come up with different practical solutions for where and when protests can happen. When I was in Canada, I did not feel that you should be able to protest where you would actually interrupt the flow of traffic in front of a hospital. That, ultimately, an ambulance needs to be able to drive in and drive out of a hospital. So when and where you can interrupt traffic, I think legally and morally, I think that's an important question to ask. And if you watching this, if you're organizing a vegan group now or a political protest group, you can resolve these problems yourself. You don't have to wait for Parliament. You don't have to wait for the constitution of your country to change. Write your own constitution for your political group and define, say, if you are a member of this group, this is what's acceptable and this is what's not acceptable. You should explicitly define that you embrace only nonviolent methods, and you should explicitly define which methods of protest are acceptable and which are not acceptable. So for your group, if you make a moral commitment that you're not going to harass people at their home, you're only going to protest in front of City Hall, in front of Parliament, and these kinds of places, that's a commitment you can put in writing, and you can have everyone who joins your group sign a memorandum or read and sign that they understand the Constitution for your political party, for your group, for your lobby, however you want to define it. So I just say you don't have to wait for other people to define that for you from the top down. It's very useful for us as activists, and if you're forming a foundation of any kind, define it for yourself. You decide what's appropriate. You decide your ethical commitments. And then if you have a member of your group who starts to get out of line, you can remind them you made a moral commitment when you joined this group to only work within these guidelines. So now if you're breaking the guidelines, we can ask you to leave. Now, in my own life, in the last couple of years, I have had to invoke the legal definition of harassment in Canada many times for the following peculiar reason. When I was at the University of Victoria, I formally complained that the courses I was attending were garbage. Now, legally, I can come here and state on the record with no fear of being sued that the courses were garbage because I went through that complete complaints process. I filled out all the forms and so on. I did not protest. I did not yell at anyone. I did not interrupt the flow of traffic. I went to the office of the Ombudsman, which is a formal bureaucratic way to complain. I found out what the correct procedure was to complain that a course at the university was lousy. I took that complaint to the head of the program. The head of the program took it to the head of the department. The head of the department took it to the dean. So then I was in a complaints process, a formal complaints process that involved the dean, head of my department, ultimately the professors teaching the course, and the office of the ombudsman. A lot of paperwork, a lot of stress. Now the dean lost patience, and the dean tried to intimidate me into basically giving up on this complaint that the course was garbage, and it has real serious impacts for my life. It does. I went to that university just to learn Chinese as a language, and the Chinese language courses were garbage. And I gave detailed, very responsible accounts of exactly why the course was garbage, exactly why the course did not live up to the minimum standard that it should live up to. And the dean responded to this by accusing me of harassment and saying that I could be punished or I could be kicked out of the university if I continue with this harassment. This is a great example of how the concept of harassment is abused to shut down dissent, when the university should have been taking my feedback seriously and really looking at what was wrong with this course and how the course could be fixed, because the course could be fixed. Really, it would not be impossible at all for them to have made very serious improvements to that course with very little effort, very little money. They didn't want to do that. It was easier for them to try to silence the one student who was willing to really step forward and complain. The vast majority of students were much easier to intimidate into silence because they just wanted to get good grades. They just wanted to get on with their lives. Even though I think every single student I talked to about that course agreed that the course was absolutely terrible or was deeply disappointing. They had slightly differing opinions on it from different perspectives, as you'd expect. However, I'm much older than the other students. I'm much more confident. I'm much more able to operate in a tense political atmosphere, which is exactly what I had to deal with. I had to go sit in a boardroom and look at the dean in his face and present complaints on paper and present the complaints verbally and go through bureaucratic process. Now, apart from the fact that it would be absurd under any circumstances to accuse a student of engaging in harassment when that student has followed exactly this process, has done the paperwork. I mean, if a student following the complaints process is guilty of harassment, then nobody has the right to complain, right? It must be that, the official complaints process can't be harassment by definition. But I didn't even have to deal with that kind of argument. All I did again and again was quote to him the law in Canada that defines harassment. I said, no, this is not harassment. This is me very properly and correctly complaining that your course is terrible. And the law in Canada very nicely defines harassment as something that would cause the other person to feel fear. And if you look at the precise wording, it specifies that it would cause a reasonable person to feel afraid. Now, there are many funny examples of this in the history of the world. I think when they wrote that in Canada, they were really thinking of iconic biker gangs, because many of our legislators in Canada are a bit obsessed with biker gangs as symbolizing organized crime. But the point is, if, for example, a biker gang brings a whole group of motorcycles in front of your house and just parks them there, they may not be threatening you, they may not state any threat, but if this is in the context of you having a conflict with these biker gangs, if, for example, a journalist has been writing articles about the biker gangs and their illegal activities, and then mysteriously 50 motorcycles are parked in front of that journalist's house, the point is this law is worded in a way so that this could be addressed as harassment. If someone takes a snake and puts it on your desk, or takes a snake and puts it in your mailbox, even if the snake is not venomous, the snake couldn't actually harm you. It may not be a threat, but under this Canadian law, it may be harassment. Now, again, we could use the example of a journalist. If someone is trying to threaten a journalist, they might indeed put a snake in their mailbox. I remember one case of that happening specifically, or put a snake on their desk. Now, on the other hand, the reason why it says that whether or not it would cause a reasonable person to feel afraid in those circumstances, on the other hand, if you're a scientist who studies snakes, maybe putting a snake on your desk is completely normal and happens every day at your office, and, the law shouldn't be applied in this way. So it's written in a way to be somewhat flexible. These are the circumstances we're living in 2016. Most English-speaking Western countries have extremely vague laws defining what harassment is, and these impact veganism, animal rights, and ecology negatively in two different ways. I've said it before, but I'll say it again and then end this video. One is the actual enforcement of these laws from the top down, which is sporadic, it's inconsistent, it only happens once in a while with no explanation, but it's a major problem for us as a movement. The fact that in England anything can be punished as harassment, any political movement, doesn't mean that everything is published as harassment, but once in a while, they can decide that any animal rights group or ecological group or someone who protests in front of McDonald's trying to convince people not to eat at McDonald's, that they are guilty of harassment under the Serious Organized Crime and Police Act. And it happens sometimes. But the fact that these laws are not enforced all the time doesn't mean that a law of this kind isn't having a chilling effect on the use of free speech at all times. It does. And The secondary knock-on effect, which is something we can all solve today and we can all end tomorrow, is exactly that vegans accuse other vegans of harassment. And you need to stop and meditate on what that really means and what the implications really are. What does it mean to accuse Sorcha Morava of harassment? I've already said she's not guilty of being a militant. To my knowledge, she's not guilty of harassment. I haven't seen every video she's made. But someone making a comedy video that calls someone else an idiot, that calls someone else dumb, that is not harassment, especially not under Canada's definition. It's not a threat. It's not something that would cause them to be afraid. It's not something that would suppress their use of freedom of speech. On the contrary, we as vegans, it may make you feel more intelligent to reproach someone like Sorcha by saying she's guilty of harassment. But in reality, what you're doing is stifling freedom of speech. You're stifling, our potential for dissent, for debate, and ultimately to get organized and engage in real-world activism.